EVE Online, a humble beginning space sci-fi pioneer that not only managed to become a major MMORPG, but is still one 20 years later. That means, as you probably have intuited, or read the title of this video, we are not covering EVE Online today. However, we are covering Dust 514, or Dust 514, an FPS shooter companion game that was linked to EVE Online and was meant to fill the planetary combat that it lacked. Dust 514 was released May 14, 2013, and although it had all the backing and support to become not only the first true companion shooter to an MMORPG, it could have become absolutely revolutionary in the process. Instead, after merely 1 year, it was already seemingly abandoned for another shiny FPS project, and then 2 years later, shut down altogether. What went wrong with Dust 514, CCP's big trump card in the online space that became nothing more than a footnote to a long pioneer of a career in EVE Online? We will find out that, and more, on this episode of Death of a Game, a series where we cover the largest contributing factors for a game or company's death or demise. Pay attention to the clues along the way as we collect them all for the final deduction. You know, every detective's favorite part of the mystery, and stay to the very end of the video to see a hint on what the next case will be about. Visit our Patreon, donate on PayPal, or use any of our premium or paid YouTube links or aspects, or affiliate links to support the channel, and help us make more content like this. I also take paid Death of a Game episode requests as well. I do this for a living, and need to pay both my bills and my editor, especially because I don't rely on popular trends or mass clicks to make money. Donating even $1 means that you 333x'd your normal view money generating amount. That's pretty insane. But don't worry, if you don't have any money to donate, just watching, supporting the content, helping the engagement, and joining things like Discord or following me on Twitter also help as well. Thanks for the continued support. CCP Games was founded in Reykjavik, Iceland, June 1997, with the purpose of creating MMORPGs from the start. Though, to be clear, when they say that in these little blurbs, MMORPG as a term didn't even exist for another 2 or 3 years. But what they mean is making MUDs, or multi-user dungeons, which is what they were going by at the time. With the launch of EVE Online in 2003, CCP Games wouldn't light the world on fire right away. Actually, they had quite the humble upbringing, and a path many other MMOs should follow suit, instead of expecting fame and big lights at the start. CCP Games would slowly build up EVE Online into a major multi-million-dollar earning virtual world, and one that would take its place as basically the de facto space sci-fi MMORPG in the space, especially because so many of them have already died. And in that process, had their eyes set on more than just EVE Online. CCP wanted to grow their metaverse, or their EVE-verse, to make not only EVE Online bigger, but also more impactful and the IP bigger, period. CCP Games would announce one of their first side projects dubbed Dust 514, and it was meant to be a companion FPS game that could leverage the lack of gameplay in EVE Online, often described as a spreadsheet simulator and a slow, long-form progression type game. Dust 514, by contrast, was a fast-paced first-person shooter that allowed for up to 256 players at the same time to fight each other over planetary control. This planetary control would be based on the corporations in EVE Online, competing over territory, which would then allow the Dust portion of the game to take place on the actual planets themselves. The comparisons to PlanetSide were made right away, even though the game didn't necessarily actually resemble what PlanetSide was. It was a first-person planetary shooter game, and when it was described, it did kind of sound like PlanetSide, which might actually end up being a double-edged sword. Dust 514 would showcase their gameplay for the first time in the form of a trailer released in 2009. The trailer that would showcase the game being somewhat close to PlanetSide, at least based on the first impressions, which was setting expectations absolutely skyrocket high. But what was shown, especially for EVE fans, was certainly impressive. Tyrannus would lead the charge, being the EVE expansion that brought life to the planets. It would allow for exploration and holding industry on the planets themselves, which would lead the way for the later connection with Dust 514. I think this was actually an incredibly interesting concept. Not only do I love the idea of companion games, even in the form of mobile apps for MMORPGs, the idea of an actual side game that is connected to the same virtual world just kind of gets my mouth watering. Especially with such a difference in gameplay, really attracting an all-new fan base to the EVE IP, and potentially even having runoff to join EVE Online itself on PC. Dust 514 was also a modern attempt to bring in new fans, which was far less risky than designing an all-new MMO or trying to redo the old one. CCP Games would license Unreal Engine 3 as the engine of choice for their upcoming planetary shooter. This might have tickled some of the brains listening now, because although UE3 was a massively successful engine, in massive environments with hundreds of players, it oftentimes has not only been poor performing, but has had game-breaking performance because of it. We have tons of examples of this in the series, so go check out more episodes. For example, most famously, that I remember, APB, All Points Bulletin, and Marvel Heroes, though there seriously is a lot more examples. It should also be mentioned that the CCP team behind Dust 514 was not the core EVE team, nor the main studio either. It was a newly created and appointed Shanghai studio dubbed CCP Shanghai. This is a team I can find very little information about specifically, which is very likely due to them being a new team and not led by a veteran team. While that doesn't necessarily mean that they can't be capable of greatness, it meant not having veteran FPS leadership with an understanding of virtual worlds, which is already pretty rare, could be quite problematic, as one might imagine when trying to create and sell that exact type of game. While hiring and using another team is not where my issues lie with them not doing enough due diligence when building the new team, especially when money wasn't nearly as much of an issue as it was before when they first started their company. Worst of all, if you don't hire a good team, but keep putting resources into them in the hope that they do improve, they could just keep making you dud after dud, and well, I will let the story tell the rest on that note. Dust 514 would release yet another trailer a few years after their first, and Dust 514 was shaping up to be everything we were expecting based on the initial looks from it. Now we had far more complete gameplay and footage showcased, as well as vehicular combat and destruction. The trailer also showcased how Dust was connected to EVE. I honestly think EVE has a great track record of trailers in general, and this trailer is no different and was fantastic. The hype for Dust 514, even for non-EVE players, was pretty high, but again, it sets a very high expectation that you are this planetary combat game that links to space, essentially being more and offering more than even Battlefront, Battlefield, or PlanetSide could even offer. Now, I get the idea of creating hype and excitement, and making great trailers actually helps with that, of course, but there's also such a thing as setting expectations a bit too high and not being able to realistically satisfy them. Major news concerning Dust 514 would drop in 2012, and that was that the game would be now free to play, when it recently was supposed to cost $10 and then before that $20, which should actually help with how much it's played. The other big news was that Dust 514 would only be launching on PS3, PlayStation 3. And yeah, you heard that right. Although the PS4 would launch the following year, which you might think is sort of bad luck, but it's probably them not paying attention to the news cycle, because PS and Xbox, it's almost impossible for them to sneak releases, and I don't think they've ever snuck releases. This would mean that the PS3 release would be outdated almost immediately, and whatever they were capable of accomplishing there, they wouldn't be able to take a whole lot of that progress to PS4, because it's a whole new console with new optimized hardware. Even stranger, there wouldn't even be a PC launch period, which was just puzzling to say the least on top of everything. CCP would include a PS Vita app game to Dust 514, and mention the desire to launch on Xbox as well, but still choose only to launch on PlayStation. The shining light was that, and if there was one at this point, was that the game would be both free to play and feature an LOL-style microtransaction system, which was far more about cosmetics and visuals. But my issue here is what other shooter, let alone planetary shooter, was doing that. How was Dust 514 even going to make money with dated visuals on the PS3 platform only? There's going to be a pretty clear theme going forward, and going forward into other CCP games. It's a bit of an elephant in the room, but it must be addressed. And it's something that even CCP fans can't deny. It's that CCP has basically failed everything else besides EVE Online that they have touched. I mean, they even started before Dust 514 technically with the World of Darkness IP that was supposed to be worked on for a number of years at the time, would go on for like a decade plus, and then end up being cancelled before ever launching. Of recent time, I would argue that only EVE Valkyr is the only game that has had some level of success. Dust 514 would launch on PS3 only May 14th, 2013, and would score a 59 out of 100 from 31 different critics, and user scores were 6.1 and below. Dust 514 would be rated by IGN a mere 5.8 out of 10 though, and accused of poor shooting and driving mechanics and a grindy free-to-play economy blot. Dust 514 truly aims high with a one-of-a-kind cross-platform endeavor, but such ambition is in vain if you don't have a solid foundation, and Dust crumbles almost from the get-go. Its wonky mechanics, weak graphics, and microtransaction-fueled grind make it numbing to play long enough to explore its depth, and its persistent elements are completely lost on anyone who doesn't already have a foot down in the EVE universe. The ideas behind Dust 514 are clearly strong, but so too is the disappointment when they crumble under the weight of its free-to-play baggage. I'll slight disagree here. I don't actually think that the weight of the free-to-play baggage crumbles much of anything when the base foundation of Dust 514 was never even considered even average. It's a worse game than Battlefield, Battlefront, and PlanetSide by country miles, and those were direct competition, especially Battlefield and PlanetSide. Not only are the shooting and driving mechanics lackluster in Dust 514, as covered by IGN and many other critics, the actual hook of Dust 514 itself, for me, as a person aware of EVE Online, is quite restrictive and boring. Dust 514 might have been striving to be an incredibly innovative title, but in reality, its only hooks are to the planetary portion of EVE Online, which were pretty undeveloped, and even that's restrictive, as they can only continue the same sort of combat and gameplay cycles. It's lackluster as a Dust 514 focused player only, and lackluster largely as an EVE Online player. And from the EVE Online perspective, the main hooks were allowing players to orbital bombard the Dust 514 player base, and the Dust 514 player base was supposedly able to return fire too, though many of these things were ideas that either took time or just never came to fruition. The senior producer of EVE Online, John Lander, stated that they had a 4.5-year roadmap planned for Dust 514 though, and it seemed like the plan very much was to build the game to something more. And as long as they kept supporting Dust 514, that certainly seemed possible. I mean, they took EVE Online from humble beginnings, remember? Though they had serious issues. The game was built on PS3, didn't work on PC, and if they wanted to continue to work on it, they were going to have to port the game no matter what. My hunch is that CCP didn't plan for the game to take so long to develop, and suddenly realized that they hadn't done the market research for the gaming space at the time, aka they could have just waited a few years, which is bizarre to see from such a veteran in the online space. Now, I knew things were bad and that CCP had to act because it's not like they had a growing PS3 audience, and even if it managed to be profitable, nobody, including me, thought that they would act so quickly in another direction just 1 year later. Project Legion would be announced May 2014 and was set to be an all-new shooter featuring an all-new engine and the same Shanghai team. Although Dust 514 and Project Legion will function independently of another, because they are different projects on different development paths. Dust itself has a lot more shooting-in-the-face action to come. So Project Legion, despite multiple calls for such, would, not be replacing Dust 514, nor would it be its successor despite others calling it that. At least, that's what CCP was saying, who had to respond to the immense amount of hate after the Dust fanbase reacted to the news. You might think that this is just them being unreasonable, but not only was Dust 514 promised years of support, it was promised to have a big update for everyone at the EVE 2014 FanFest, and instead they announced Project Legion. You can imagine the frustration. So they were understandably angry, especially when CCP was claiming that Dust 514 was profitable, and so many of these fans flew out to FanFest awaiting more positive news. This likely did a severe amount of damage to the most loyal fans of this kind of idea, the ones that could have formed the core community for Dust 514 and their customer base, and then the further iterations. CCP would claim by the beginning of 2015 that Dust was still the focus, having just launched their Uprising 1.10 patch, which would help with the MPE, the new player experience, add drop suits to the game of various types, and add a number of gameplay and balance changes. But the population data wasn't being released, and although they recently claimed that the game was profitable, that doesn't necessarily mean that it had a good, healthy, or growing player base. It just means that the game went even, which is kind of the bare minimum when you're launching a game. The momentum for Dust, already so early on into this supposed 4-year roadmap, was nearly dead in the water. 2 years after the announcement and 3 years into Dust 514, and Project Nova would come out April 25th, 2016, and in true CCP fashion would somehow be a worse game than Dust 514 despite having a better engine and better visuals. Project Nova, as Rock Paper Shotgun put it, was about as generic of a shooter that you could get, and although there were claims that it wouldn't affect Dust 514 after launch, fans just never really believed that from day one, and rightfully so. Because the same year, just 1 month later, Dust 514 would be shut down, just like that, with the claim that it didn't have enough players, which was very likely true. Now, I think that this is actually a coincidence, but naturally, it can't be understated that this looks like they were canceling the game because they wanted the other game to be the focus. But many former Dust players and EVE fans felt like CCP just kind of grabbed their ball and went home after getting frustrated without much of a fight, especially with a clear desire to continue to make games like Dust 514, at least in some sort of way. EVE jumping from a shooter project to another, desperate to make a shooter work, might be admirable, but they weren't showing any of the long-term dedication and community building processes that were needed for such. CCP wouldn't stop there either. After being acquired by infamous Korean publisher Pearl Abyss, they would express more interest in yet more EVE titles, which I respect, though sometimes that guy who's known for being so damn tough is almost too tough for their own good scenario, which kind of translates to being dumb. Anyway, memes aside, EVE Vanguard will be announced in 2023 and was looking to be another evolution of the same Dust 514 Project Legion idea. EVE Vanguard, now featuring EVE in the actual title. EVE Vanguard would feature the same connection aspects that Dust 514 would have, this time featuring mining and combat. EVE Vanguard seems like a proper evolution. If it features better gameplay than Project Legion and more EVE involvement than Dust 514, it's a market upgrade. Especially because the game is being designed for PC. EVE Vanguard might not be out yet, but there's still a chance that Dust 514 in some form could continue to live on, and at the very least, I have to admire EVE's unwillingness to give up on their idea of making the game and world bigger, which I both agree with and approve of. But they were going to have to show that resolve after launching the game too, and not just immediately get cold feet when things don't smash. With that music playing, we have reached the end of this mystery, detectives, and yes, even the case of Dust 514 in many ways was still a mystery. But for those who were paying attention along the way, you already probably cracked the case of that mystery yourself, and for those who didn't, well, why did Dust 514 die? The game on its own strength was lacking. It was overexposed and hyped. It had an inexperienced development team for an ambitious project. They kind of abandoned it for a successor. The EVE tie-ins themselves were quite weak, and not that interactive. It was only playable on PS3, which was effectively a dying platform. It had a lack of players. While it's easy to pile on CCP, and well, they probably deserve it for a number of reasons, Dust 514 probably included, lately things have only been getting worse for them, after being acquired by the Korean overlords Pearl Abyss. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that we owe them some credit for even trying to push the envelope in the first place, because doing that is incredibly risky and it didn't work out for them yet either. Being a pioneer is difficult, and it seems like CCP has continued to try to be the pioneer. CCP has never been the safe developer, and not being a safe developer not only got them the success that they got with pioneering their EVE Online title, it has allowed them to continue to attempt to push boundaries. But if EVE Project Vanguard doesn't work out though, perhaps that will actually be their last true attempt, being their third one, not counting the VR game that actually didn't do that bad. And it's more of a dogfight space combat game. So I'm eagerly awaiting the project to see if it can take what little Dust 514 did well and do it even better. Because even if that's all it amounts to, it still has the potential to be a pioneering shooter, and further cement EVE as an IP as one of the most prolific and successful virtual worlds and IPs ever. Thanks for watching.
死に絶えた東京。君の使命とは